All right, welcome to the Winner's Circle podcast with Jay, where we explore the latest insights and strategies in business and leadership. I'm your host, Jay, and today we have a very special guest with us. Joining me today is Dr. Carla Fowler, and she's the founder and the managing director of THAXA, an executive coaching firm that leverages the best ideas to integrate performance science, strategy, productivity, and psychology into our coaching. She's also an angel investor in medtech and biotech with a portfolio of over a dozen investments and she actively participates in several philanthropic and entrepreneurial organizations. She's also, one unique thing is she's also an active member of the Social Venture Partners, Rotary, Washington Women's Foundation, Alliance of Angels, and many more. I can't name them right now. So winners, let's welcome Dr. Carla Fowler as we delve deep into the topic for today, the art of decision making using principle as a guide. Welcome, Dr. Carla. How are you doing today? It's good to have you here.
Jay, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to talking about the topic today.
All right, welcome to the show. So I'm just going to go straight to the point. So what would I say? What personal experience or experiences led you to value principle-based decision-making in your career?
It's funny. It started long before actually founding my executive coaching practice, where, of course, I am working with leaders constantly as they're thinking about making decisions for their businesses that they have started, or even, within big corporations. And I think one of the first places that I actually got to really practice and think about decision making was actually when I was training as a doctor. And when you're training in medicine, one of the really interesting things and unique things about that experience is that at a relatively young age in your career, you are both expected to and trained to talk with people about really high stakes decisions. So if you think about, you walk into a room with a patient, and I was studying surgery. So of course, they're making decisions about whether or not they're going to let you operate on them, and which is no simple thing. And, you need to work through with them and help them be both informed about their choices and make big decisions about their health. And you might be the expert, as the physician, all the sort of all the details about it. But of course, it's something very personal and important to them. And so I think that was one of the first places really early in my career where I was entrusted with being a thought partner to people as they were making big decisions. And of course, some of these were life level decisions. And so I think that was maybe the first influencing point when I started to think about that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Carla. So one thing that came up to my mind when you were speaking, just like when you talk about military people, they have their training, it influenced their life decisions, how they handle things. So can you say your medical and scientific training influenced your approach to decision making?
I would say it absolutely did. And this is actually something sometimes that surprises people when they hear that I went, from a very different background into executive coaching and leadership coaching. But it's something I encourage everyone to think about, that often we have experiences in our lives or our training that have a lot of value, even if we are in a different situation. So this is kind of an aside, but I always like to encourage people to not discount things you might have learned in a different life experience or a different work experience that might actually be really relevant to, what you're doing now. So that's an aside. But to answer your question, I think that the scientific. We talked a little bit about the medical training about those high stakes decisions, but and I think that piece of the training, what it really taught me was that when you're making decisions, there are often a lot of different things going on for us in our brains, in our hearts. Like emotions are often quite involved. And that's an important thing to be aware of as you're making decisions. And we can talk a little more about how I like using principles as a way to acknowledge that that's the case, but also give us some other avenues to not just be influenced maybe by, for example, if a person's making a big decision about an illness they have, whether or not they're going to have surgery, it would be very normal for them to be feeling a lot of uncertainty or a lot of fear. And of course, those emotions and that fight or flight kind of ramped up physiology often can make us less creative. It can make us less open to certain things. It can narrow our thinking. So in medicine, how that kind of informed some of how I approach decision making in my practice is to know that you can't ignore the emotions. Like they are there. We can't pretend they're not there. And we have to accept and acknowledge them. But it doesn't mean we need to let them drive the show. But there needs to be some space to recognize that that is going on. And then, in my scientific training, so again, just to give some context, I was doing research on like cancer immunotherapy. So I was in the lab, I was using pipettes and running experiments. And one of the most influential things I took away from that, in addition to a lot of knowledge about how the immune system works, which made me a very popular person during the pandemic, but I also learned how to think about an unstructured problem. So often, for example, when you're an entrepreneur, you're having to make decisions about something that no one else is telling you what to do. It's not quite the same as when you might be in a work setting and your boss is setting the agenda and you need to figure out the how, but you don't need to make the strategic decision, right? And in science, we show up every day, and the whole reason you have a job as a scientist is because there's a lot of questions we don't know the answer to, and that we have to make a decision about how to learn the answer, how to interpret the answers we get, and how to proceed. And my mentor in my PhD was a very hands-off scientist and gave me a lot of autonomy, but that also meant, I was having to do a lot of work about figuring out how to drive my learning and, how I was going to move my scientific inquiry along. And I remember he told me, one time I came into his office and I think I was telling him, I'll run this experiment and I'm going to do this and do that. And he said to me, Carla, like, why are you doing those things? He's like, I know you can do those experiments, but why are you doing them? And he's like, what are you going to learn from those? And why are those the most important questions you could be asking? Because in retrospect, I realized I was sort of dotting the I's and crossing the T's of other people's work versus saying, what's the important thing I'm going to do? And why would it matter to the field? Why would it be important? And from an entrepreneur standpoint, the parallel might be, what are you trying to build as a product, or what service are you offering, and why is it important to the market? Why is it important to your customer? There are many things you could build or do or offer, but what might be most important? So I think when it comes back to decision making, I think a lot about, and in terms of principles, not just like there are many different decisions we could make and many reasons we could make those decisions, but I always like to come back to and be informed by what might be most important, and really spend some time thinking about it. So that's a long answer to your question, but definitely the medicine and the science background really informed how I think about decision making. And it's been fun then within the scope of working with clients who are building businesses, they are leaders, to further that that start point for me as I think about decision making.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Carla. So, I was able to pick up a lot of points, and I understand the fact that you need to stick to your principle. But if we say stick to the principle, let's just say somebody, maybe one of the listeners is probably asking a vital question, which is, what are the core principles you need to rely on in your own decision-making processes, maybe both professionally or personally? So what are the core principles anyone should rely on?
This is a great question. And what I love about principles is that they point to process, like the process of making a decision, and they really help us focus on that. And the reason I want to bring that up is because we often judge the quality of our decision based on what happened, like what was the outcome. And this is an idea that was referenced. There's a great book on decision making called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And she talks about this as when we judge the quality of our decision based on what happened, what was the outcome? Was the outcome good? Was the outcome bad? As resulting, that's what she calls it. And in fact, she said, there's a lot of things that go into what the outcome of a decision was. A lot of things we actually don't control, but what we do control is our process. And so that's why I like to think about principles. And so now going to your question, what are the principles? What could someone be focused on? And so I think the first important principle that I think about is, I call it brutal focus. But what that means is when we're making a decision, we should start by trying to really get clarity on a couple of different things. But the first most important thing is to spend some time thinking about what is it that we want from the outcome? What's the goal that we are trying to work towards with a decision? And actually, sometimes we think we have a sense of like what we want, but if we actually spend a little bit of time to try and write it down, we might realize that it's not as simple as we thought. And so that act of saying, can I take sort of the fuzzy idea in my brain and actually put it down on paper and say, what do I want to have happen out of this decision? And I like to start with that question. There are actually 3 questions that I ask as a part of Brutal Focus. That is the first one. What do I want to have happen? And with that first question, one of the mistakes that can often happen is we realize that we're actually trying to make everything happen with a single decision. And this is very normal, happens to me all the time. But one of the things that's challenging about making decisions is often what is happening is we're having to choose between trade-offs. That the reason making the decision is challenging is because to get thing A that we want to have happen, we have to give up some of thing B. So there's a trade-off. Or if we want more of sort of the B area of the outcome, we have to make some sacrifices in the A area. And this is one of the challenges of decision making. But what I've noticed is that when we have a decision and we're trying to get everything out of it, what happens is we often make so many compromises that we don't get a satisfying outcome in any of the areas. Or if we don't spend time thinking about what we want, then the default is still a decision. Like, for example, not making a decision is still making a decision. It's just choosing to not have it be intentional and having sort of the default happen. So this is why question 1 is really good to think about, because even if we can't get everything we want from a single decision, I believe it is better for us to be intentional about what we're getting versus leaving it to saying, well, we'll try and get everything and then see what happens. So that's question number 1 for Brutal Focus. It's saying, what do I want? So question 2 and 3 and we can go through them one by one, are given what I've decided the outcome that I sort of want to maximize from this decision is, what do I actually think are going to be the most important priorities? So, what are the factors that in this decision we need to think about the most? Or maybe it's what might be most important that we do as a result of this decision. What are those priorities? So some of the trade-offs are we're not going to do everything, but we need to think about what's most important. And then the third question that I like to ask is, what am I intentionally not going to do or not going to worry about as I'm making this decision? Because I've decided those things are less important. They might be good, but they're less important. Or they might actually be a distraction, something that might be distracting me in making this decision that actually we need to not pay attention to. We need to focus on other things. So in terms of practicing brutal focus, I encourage people, when you have a decision, to actually give yourself some time to think about it and write about it, and go through those three questions. What do I want? What do I think is going to be most important as a piece of this decision-making process, or that we might do out of this decision-making process? And then number three, what is likely to be most distracting, or we might need to sort of ignore for the moment, even though it might be calling our attention. So that is the first principle that I like to think about. It's brutal focus, and it's a practice of trying to get some clarity and give yourself some thinking time as you're making a decision.
All right, thank you so much. And the principles were just straight up to the point. So now, talking about the principles, you have the principle set up in your mind. When it happens, you follow the principles to make your decision. But now let's use another scenario. How about when you're under pressure, or you're faced with pressure to make a quick decision? You have like 5 minutes to think about it. So how do you handle that?
This is such an important question, because I agree that sometimes if we think we always have to have days or hours to make a decision, then of course it's not very realistic. So I recommend, and I'm gonna hold this up for people who are watching, 5 minutes is worth it to spend some time thinking. Sometimes we think when we are rushed that there is no time to think, and that is not true. It means you will have a short time to think. But I very much recommend, and this can be true even in a meeting, like if you are with other people, to be able to say, or create even a small amount of space for yourself to say, I need to think about that. And even in 5 minutes with like a small piece of paper, that's why I'm holding up this Post-it pad, it's like the abbreviated version, to ask yourself, what is most important? Like, what's the most important outcome we need to get from this? What might be most important for us to know? Like, is there more information we need? But you can run through those questions pretty quickly, and it will be better than forcing yourself literally on the spot to answer. Even 5 minutes makes a big difference. The other thing that I think can be helpful in those moments when you don't have a lot of time to make a decision is to actually think a little bit about, all right, is this something where we can make a decision because we are rushed? Maybe we don't have all the information, but we need to make a decision. Is there a way for us to make it reversible? So that's an interesting thing you can think about. So this has been talked about as like, is it a one-way door that you're going through, or a two-way door? Like, so you could go out the door and come back in. So sometimes when you have to make a fast decision, you should ask yourself if there's a way to set it up to be reversible if in fact you realize like, oh, okay, that was not actually the decision. It didn't turn out how we wanted. The other thing is, can you make it a decision that is not binary, like 100% one thing or 100% another thing? So sometimes it's worth saying, can we try this? Can we do this sort of halfway before we lean fully into it? So sort of not putting everything on the line immediately. So I think those are often some helpful principles when we are rushed to actually do this. And then the last thing I'll say is, if we have a practice, and this is why in entrepreneurship, I always recommend this, a practice of doing some periodic reflecting along the way when you're not rushed, helps you then in the moments when you are rushed, because your brain has already been kind of primed to have some deeper quality answers to some of the bigger questions that help you in that fast moment as you sort of reference back against those.
All right. Thank you so much for the good information, because you spoke about reversible decisions. So I just want you to talk a little bit more about it. How can people implement that?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. So, and this actually gets to another one of my principles. So, as a piece of the process. So maybe this is a good time to talk about that, if that sounds good to you. So, one of the things that comes up in decision making, you know how we talked about the emotion of it, that a lot of that stress or pressure is because we have some uncertainty about it. And we're going to make a decision. We don't know how the decision's going to turn out. And that can be very uncomfortable. It can be stressful. And this is something that our brains, we were sort of built to not like uncertainty, because uncertainty often reflected something that could be dangerous to us, right? That we would not survive. And this is less true of business decisions now. It's usually not life or death, but it still feels really uncomfortable to our brains when we are faced with uncertainty. And so a principle that I work with a lot of clients on is this idea of learning to relish uncertainty. And when I say that, I'm not saying that the uncertainty is going to feel more comfortable, because it will still be uncomfortable. That's just the way it is. But the thing about uncertainty that's really interesting is it's often where there is some uncertainty, that's also where we have opportunity. That's why entrepreneurship has opportunity, maybe more opportunity associated with it than if you just have a regular job. It's because you're taking some risks, you're willing to go out and do something different or new for the marketplace. There's both the uncertainty, but there's also the opportunity that comes with it. And the other opportunity is not just maybe the financial opportunity, but that I've observed over my years of coaching that when we are at the edge of our knowledge, when we are at that moment of uncertainty, we often have the most to learn and grow. That those are the scenarios that push us the most personally. Now, they're uncomfortable, they could be stressful, but and as a result, we often, when we find ourselves in those moments, we sometimes seek to control what's happening. So maybe we like overly micromanage something, or we rush a decision because we're trying to control it. The other thing we do with uncertainty is we often avoid it. So for example, we might avoid making a decision because we're worried we're going to make the wrong decision. And so we kind of sit on it. We say, well, I'm still thinking about it. But maybe we miss the moment of opportunity to like launch a new product or try something. And so these are some things that are very normal for us to do. We all do them. But I like to have the principle of relishing the uncertainty, because it gives us a way to say, all right, I'm uncomfortable, but I also know this is a moment when I have opportunity. And so it would be a very reasonable question to say, okay, Carla, that's great, but how do you do that? So I think that there are two different pieces of learning to relish uncertainty. One is like a mindset or a perspective piece. And the other piece is about some actions we can take. So the first thing, just from our perspective, that I think about is that we can reframe the uncertainty as something we can be curious about. And the best example or story I have of this is going to the movies. Jay, do you like going to the movies, or have you seen a good movie lately?
Yeah, I went to the movies like some weeks ago. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, that's great. And
Yeah.
like, if you're going to go see a new movie, the last thing you want is for your friend to say, that movie was great, but it was really sad how that guy died in the end. Right? Like the total spoiler alert, where you're like, what?
I don't want.
Like the hero,
Yeah,
right?
true.
Like, I don't want to hear that. Or even if it's a happy ending, you don't want them to say, oh, so cool how, they totally, conquered the robots at the end. You're like, don't ruin it for me. The thing is, the reason spoiler alerts is like a concept is because we actually like to be in the moment of uncertainty. There is something that makes it really alive for us. Even if we're nervous, even if we're in the movie and we're like, oh no, what's going to happen? It is part of why it's exciting, is because we don't know what's going to happen. And so I encourage people to think a little bit about when they're feeling that uncertainty and they're uncomfortable, to say, like, I am in the part of the movie. I'm in the part of the movie where we don't know what's going to happen. And yet, in movies, as we know, there's often many different ways that people end up solving the problem. And also, there are many different outcomes that are different than what we thought, that actually can be a positive outcome. Like sometimes the movie ends totally not in the way we thought it was going to, but still in a positive way. And so I always, as a little bit of a mantra, people can remind themselves that there is more than one good way to get somewhere, and there is more than one good place to get to. And then I think the last piece of mindset that can be really helpful is just to give your future self some credit. So you might need to make a decision in the face of uncertainty, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Maybe it's what you hoped for, maybe it's not. But you can't solve for that today because you don't have the data. You don't know what's going to happen. But you can trust your future self that once you see what happened and you have the data, that you will be able to make another decision or a next choice to deal with whatever that is. But you can't do it today because you don't know yet. But your future self is very capable. And so I like that. Like, your future self is very capable. Trust that person. So those are some of the mindsets that I think are very helpful. And then we can get into some of the actions, because again, people are like, well, what do I do though? The thing that I was really thinking about when you were asking your question was that often what we need to do when we're making a decision, we're trying to decide how we might make it reversible, or just learn something, not have to go all in or all out, is this idea of running good experiments. So certainly, if you're making a decision, there might be homework you can do. So if there are some gaps in your knowledge that you could easily research or ask someone about, certainly do that by all means. But the key is there's a lot of stuff you can't learn without doing something. And that's where the experiments can be very helpful. And of course, I take this from my science days. And the idea of looking at something and saying, well, how do we run an experiment? How do we test something? And so sometimes this might be to say, what would be an easy way to try out a new service with the market in a really scaled back way? Like, we're not going to fully develop it, but just to get like an MVP, a minimum viable product. And how could we test it with some of our customers and get some really good feedback, so that we can decide, for example, do we want to go all in on that? Do we want to spend a lot of resources to fully develop it? But so sometimes it's to say, what's a really minimal version of something that we could go test? And who would be the right customers to test it with? How could we get that feedback? How long do we want to test it? What do we think it would look like if people really liked it and we should go forwards with it, what would be the kind of feedback we might get if actually it's not a good idea to go forward with? And so what I like about experiments is experiments are for learning. They're not really for being right or being wrong. It's all about what can I test so I could learn something that then would inform my next decision. So this, when you talk about making something reversible, I immediately thought about like, one way to do this is to say, let's run an experiment and do a scaled back version. Or maybe it's the full version, you already have it, but you're going to use it with a new market. So you say, okay, let's try it in this other niche over here, see what people think. So that's what I thought of, Jay, when you asked your question.
All right. That was very powerful. And I learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners are going to learn more from that information. So, but when you were talking, a whole lot of things was coming through my mind, and I was thinking about some certain things because I know there's one thing to have principle, then there's another thing to encounter challenges. So I'm going to ask you a direct question. So have you ever, you know, faced any challenges or encounter any challenges while trying to maintain your principles? And how did you overcome them? Because there's one thing to have a good principle, this is my set of rules, and there's some certain, probably another person's principles and, clash and all that. How were you able to
Yeah.
overcome that situation?
Yeah. This is such a good question because I believe principles are important. But Jay, you are absolutely right that when you meet reality, it's important that we not think that any of these principles are a silver bullet, like that they just solve everything. Because entrepreneurship can often feel and look messy. And when I left medicine and science and started my own business, and that is not the first challenge I've encountered in my life, but certainly it was a very big pivot for me. And because in medical school, I learned lots of medicine and I learned lots about science, but they do not teach you anything about how to run a business, about entrepreneurship. That was all very new to me. Also it was very unstructured. So we've been talking about decision making when it's not someone else telling you what to do, when it's not, very clear. Like in medicine, what you do every day is very clear. You sort of have a clear set of things. So, when I left medicine and started my practice, I designed my methodology, and no one knew me for who I was as an executive coach. They were like, "Oh, are you a doctor?" That much was very clear. But really connecting me to the new profession and starting a business, very, very challenging. One of the things when you are trying to build a lot of things all at once is you're going to make a lot of decisions, and sometimes you won't always get the data back when it's early. But you have to make some decisions because you can't do everything. And one of the things that became really important for me as I was going through that was to have almost like some day-to-day principles to just help continue to build momentum. Because the key thing when you're an entrepreneur and you're starting out is you don't want to be sitting at your desk alone. Speaking, I think my recommendation, my advice is often like, you want to be out interacting with people, building some visibility, getting information back. And that's not to say you don't spend some time at your desk thinking about it too and absorbing it, but it is very hard to create a business solely alone in a room. And so one of the tools that I really used in this challenging moment when I had no clients, I'm just starting and I'm trying to help people see me as being something really different and explain something new even to the coaching world. Like, I'm using performance science to do my coaching, and that wasn't something that people were very familiar with. So the tool I used, because I realized one of the most important things I needed to do was just start networking and build visibility for myself, and also try and see if what I was offering, if anybody wanted it. I mean, I know people hire coaches all the time, but I thought probably the market could have one more coach in the mix, but I didn't know if people were interested in performance science in the way I was, and using that to enhance their leadership. So the tool that I really used to just on a day-to-day basis build that momentum, I call it like the 90-90-90 principle. And it's based on the idea that there are many ways we can succeed, but only a few ways that we fail. So the first 90 in the 90-90-90 principle is that 90% of people don't get started. So even if you're not sure what you're doing is the right thing, getting started and doing something puts you ahead of 90% of people. Like, because then you are moving. You are willing to take the first risk, and you're going to get some information. Maybe people love it, maybe people don't love it. That's okay. That's all information, and it will move you forwards versus, again, sitting alone at your desk. So that's the first 90. Get started. If you can get started, like, you will be ahead of 90% of people. Okay. The second 90 is that when people get started, then sometimes they don't keep going, right? They start, but then they sort of immediately stop. Maybe, when I started out and I started having coffees with people and I pitched my business for the first time, and some people were like, I don't get it, or how is this different from, regular coaching? Or maybe they were just not that interested. If I then stopped because I thought, oh, they don't like it, I guess my idea is a bad one, like, then that would have been the end. But I just kept going out and having more coffees and practicing, because some of what you're doing is just getting used to entrepreneurship and like selling your idea. And it is rocky and it is rough. And my pitches were like not that great at the beginning. And I was probably kind of awkward. And I have a lot of gratitude to every person who had a coffee with me in those first, 6 months, as I was like learning to talk about my business and pitch and really work on that. And so the second 90 is, if you keep going after you start, even if you're not sure it's working, you need to give it some time, and you need to give yourself some room to like get better at the thing, even explain your idea better, right? Or pitch your business or your value proposition a little bit better. And then I think the third 90 is, so let's say if you get started and then you keep going, you stick with it. That puts you, again, ahead of so many people. So then the third 90, let's say you've gotten started, you kept going, you didn't give up too soon. The third 90 is now many people who keep going, they never try anything different. They just sort of keep doing the same thing over and over again. So if you want to be in that last 10%, what I really recommend is, after you've really gotten used to doing the thing. So for me, it was, I got used to like going out, asking people to coffee, telling them about what I was doing, building those relationships. And over time, I naturally got better at that. But then like the last part was like, is there something different I could be doing that might make this work better? Like, for example, maybe there are some ways in which I should both chat with people, but also send them some resources afterwards that are helpful. Or, are there ways now that I'm comfortable doing the thing that I could now see that I could improve it? Or maybe I could read a book on relationship-based sales and learn some new things about how to do it better. So that last 90 is when you really start to iterate and improve what you're doing. And the reason I put that in the third 90 is, if we try to do that improvement too early, sometimes we get really discouraged and we give up too soon. So if you try and do the third 90 in the second 90, I find that sometimes it disrupts building the habit. So second 90 is really about just keep going, build the habit. It will inform what you do in the third 90. but don't try and do all the steps at the same time. Especially don't try to do the third 90 when you're just trying to get started. Just get started. Don't worry about what it looks like. That is both like an example, and it is not the only challenge that I have faced, but of a really big challenge, and also a principle that I think helps us in the messy day to day. Yes, the principles are good. It's always good to have them, but sometimes we need something that just helps us right now as we are in the thick of a challenge, day by day. What can we do? And that's why I love the 90-90-90 principle. Is it just points to what can you do right now? Is there something you haven't started? How could you start? Is there something you've started but you haven't been consistent at? How could you create more consistency for yourself? And then finally, if you've been doing something for a while but you're not sure how effective it is, what could you do to learn more about it and improve how you're doing it? Change it a little bit so it's more effective. And that's that third 90. So that's what I think when it's messy, when it's hard, I love the 90-90-90 tool.
All right. So you said a word, you said change it a little bit. Maybe it's going to be effective. So that's a very good word, because one question that came up to my mind that, because entrepreneurship itself is a tough world. It's quite tough. But once you have a guiding principle that you're following, there's, there's more probability that you're going to get to the promised land compared to somebody who is just, just doing anything, who doesn't have a guiding principle. So this is my take. So I want to ask a question, all right? Because I know you have a principle when you're a doctor. You had a principle you follow, the principle guidelines you follow.
Yeah.
When you're a doctor, you're in the medical field. And so the question will now be, how has your principles evolved over the course of your career? And what factors influence these changes? Because I know the principles you're using as a medical doctor might be different, or if it's not different, maybe you should explain to us how you can keep one principle within two, field of careers. That would be great too. So either way, yeah.
That is such a good question. And certainly there are like levels of principles. So, for example, in medicine, we have like standard of care, or basically it's the protocols you follow to treat a patient. Now, obviously on a day-to-day basis now, that's not relevant for me in terms of because I'm not working with people in a medical capacity. But I will say that all along the way, even as I thought I was going to become a doctor and like an academic medical scientist, there were principles that I used. Some have changed. So one example is, and I think this is true for many of us when we're younger in our career, is we don't know that much. Just not because we're not smart, but just because we haven't been exposed to very much. We just don't have as much experience. And so when we're early in our careers, one of the most important things we can do is work really hard. What we do have is energy, when we're younger. And so even if we don't know that much, we can often substitute by outworking the problem. And I definitely did that. I mean, I didn't come from a family who had any doctors in it. So I was the first person to go to medical school. And so I didn't have a lot of preconceived, ideas about how does one do this process. But I knew that, well, you need to study hard and you need to do that. And so cram as much as you need to before the test, because those things matter. That is an example of something that has changed over time. So I know for many leaders, or even for many entrepreneurs who aren't within a corporate system, there comes a point where you can't work harder. You're already working as hard as you can. And so this is one of the principles that's changed a little bit, is to say it's not always the right strategy to try and outwork a problem. Sometimes it is. I think early sometimes early in your business, you don't know exactly what's going to hit. And so you want to just work a lot and figure out what will work. But later on, if you're growing, often we need to make more time to not be pushing at the edges of how hard we're working, but we need more time to think. We actually need our brains to be more rested so we can lead the group of our business. And it's no longer on us to be working in the day-to-day, but maybe we are like leading the team that is executing. And our most important thing is how well can we see the future? How well can we think proactively and have that vision for the business? How can we think about what's going to be needed to scale? And so that's a principle that also shifted for me when I went from, working 80 to 100-hour weeks as a surgery resident into coaching. I realized that I needed, my brain needed to be rested. I needed to not work so many hours, but I needed to work better. I needed to work smarter, and I needed time to think. So that was an interesting principle that has changed over the course of my career. And I think one principle that didn't change, and I'm not sure where it came from, but I think intuitively, because as a young person, I always liked to do a lot of things. So I like to do the sports, I did music, obviously school was important, and some other things. And so I just always wanted to be involved in everything. But if you want to be involved in everything, then you really have to think about how you use your time. And you have to be very potent about when you're practicing your musical instrument. I played French horn. That's what I played. And so when you practice, you have to be really efficient, because I didn't have, 2 hours to practice. I had 30 minutes or 1 hour to practice. So one of the things I think I learned was how to identify, if I was not going to do everything, what were the most important things I needed to do to keep excelling in, whether it was the sport or the school. And I think that's something that served me very well. As I said, I want multiple things. So how do I figure out what's most important? And so this comes back to that first principle we talked about, the idea of brutal focus. And that I've carried with me, I think, through my whole career, and I think still serves me well today.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for that clarification. And a follow up on your points. So now that you've been able to explain to us how you're able to evolve, switch your principles, and make sure you balance your principles. So how can you help leaders, business owners, founders, entrepreneurs, and different business leaders? How can you help them, evaluate and adjust their principle as they gain more experience and even face new challenges? How can you?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I do as a coach is coaching ends up being a dedicated time, right? It goes on the calendar, and we talk, and because it is something that goes on the calendar, it ends up being scheduled thinking time for them with a thought partner. And in our dialogue, I am often asking questions that help them do that focus, that help them think, have some time, but also a dialogue partner to say, well, what's really most important here? What is most important that is coming up for your business? What's most important about what you're doing with your team, right? And it ends up being, because it's so easy for that time not to have time to do that kind of thinking when work is busy, things are moving quickly. So one of the things is I often bring the lens of focus, and I ask questions that they can reflect on that help them practice that focus. But I think the other thing is, as a thought partner, sometimes they are dealing with a challenge, like what you brought up. They hit the bumps in the road. And so those are moments when sometimes we focus on the strategy, on the focus part. What do they want to have happen? What's going to be most important? Sometimes in those moments, what's most important is for them to have some support, right? Like a person to talk with how it is challenging, who acknowledges it is challenging, but also encourages them, helps them find some mindsets to deal with the uncertainty or some actions, as we talked about, to deal with that uncertainty. So sometimes that's the role I play as a coach that is helpful. And then I think the third role that I play is sometimes we just feel better when we get into action and we build momentum, like we talked about with the 90-90-90 tool. And so sometimes my role is to help them plan some really concrete ways to, they have a problem. Okay. How could we get started solving that? What would be the first steps? How do we get you through that first 90? Okay. What does it look like to go through the second 90? So sometimes it's very practical and like execution. It's like an execution thing. So that's how I think about coaching, is that there are multiple modes that I can work in, and they each go back to one of the big areas of performance science, which is at the end of the day, I think made up of three big buckets. Like you've got your strategy, what's most important and what are your priorities? You've got execution. How do you get going and build momentum executing on those priorities? And then the third piece is, how do you stay motivated? How do you work through uncertainty? How do you keep your confidence and your mindset in a good place? Because as you said, Jay, like entrepreneurship is hard. And yet it can be the thing that feels most alive for the portion of us who choose to go do that and pursue that. And that is how I help and how I think about coaching.
All right, thank you so much. So you spoke about performance science, just the way you talk about, you know, you most of your points you always put the word performance science. So what exactly inspired you, to integrate the principles from performance science into decision making process? Because it's quite unique.
Yeah. Well, I think what inspired me was, well, number one, I am a scientist, and I think I've always thought like a scientist. Like I loved the idea that things were solvable, that there might be something, not just how I was feeling on any given day, that would help me solve my problem. So, in the start, it wasn't even about coaching other people. I wanted to understand how to perform at a high level, and I wanted some guidance. I wanted a guide. And because I think like a scientist, I'm very curious about how do our minds work, even how our body physiology works. And that's how I ended up going into medicine and science, I think, in the first place. But that's how I think about problems. And I also felt like other people, when they're doing challenging things, are looking for something solid to kind of hold on to base their decisions on, to base how they proceed, versus just, do I feel good today? Do I feel bad today? What did that person over there say to me, right? Like the social influences, something more solid than that. And I think there are a lot of great thinkers who are contributing to the field of performance science, both around strategy, around psychology, also around even productivity, right? And how do we execute well at scale? And I thought that would just be a good grounding. It would give people something to come back to again and again to inform when they're not quite sure what to do. It's not that it tells you prescriptively what to do for any given decision, but it gives you a framework. It gives you a guide. And so that's kind of what drew me to it. And I just personally am fascinated with it. So selfishly, when I asked myself, like, what could I be interested in for a whole career? I thought the depth of performance science, it was deep enough that it could, keep me interested and engaged.
All right. So thank you for that information as we round up today, because we spent a long time and it felt like we've not even started. It feels like it felt quite short because it's very interesting. So I want to ask a question, right? It's not a question, it's just this or that, right? The this or that is data-driven decision making or intuitive judgment. Which one would you take?
This or that.
Data-driven or intuition?
I really struggle with this or that questions, and I will tell you why. I think no, I know I'm
Oh, okay.
not behaving well as a guest. But the reason is because I believe that when we force ourselves into binary, it's this or it's that, we constrain ourselves in a way that doesn't always lead to the best performance. And this is why I'm being a bad guest right now. I'm not answering your question, but I think that
So
it's
it's fine.
important
It's
to
fine.
pay attention to both. So to both ask yourself, it's a really useful question to say, what is my intuition telling me? And then like also to take a look at, all right, well, if I ran a process like with more process to it just versus just my gut, like what might that look like? The other thing that's interesting is that sometimes our intuition is actually informed by past processes we have run. So the idea that your intuition might tell you something does not mean that that is not process based. It may just be informed that you almost don't see how it is connected to thinking you did in the past where you actually ran some process, like looked at principles, but now it's so buried deep in your brain that it feels intuitive. So I guess the other thing I'm saying is these things aren't necessarily opposite things. They actually can be integrated. And so that's why I recommend saying, spend some time thinking about things so that if you find yourself in a moment where you have to make a fast decision and you may have to go with your gut at that moment. In fact, that is often what people describe in that moment. I don't have time to run a process. What do I feel and think right now? That your intuition will be informed by the good work you've done previously. And that will make your gut instinct better. So that's how I see these things being really linked, and why your question was a complicated one for me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So you answered this very perfect. So as we round up, the last one is can you recommend 5 resources, books, or 5 resources that people can check out, if they need to learn more about today's topic, decision making?
Oh, great question. Okay. Well, I referenced one at the beginning, which is Annie Duke's book, Thinking in Bets. It is a fabulous dive into this. One of my favorite books on focus, because we talked a lot about focus, is called Essentialism. And the author's last name is McKeown. And we can get these references for the notes if that's helpful. So that's a great book, I think, on focus. Another book that I thought was really great, and this is great for any entrepreneur who feels like they never have enough time and like their to-do list is always growing. It's called 1,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. And it's sort of a philosophical book about time. It is not a productivity book, and yet I found it to be very helpful for how we think about our time, how we use our time well, and have less stress and anxiety about time. I thought that was very, very good. Let's see. In terms of other books on decision making, or actually just other resources that I recommend, I quite liked Deep Work by Cal Newport. And I think in reference to, we spent a lot of time talking about how do you have some time to think and do your best, do the work on the business or do the work on your thinking versus just working in the business, right? Taking care of things. And I thought his book was a really good guide in terms of like how to do that. And then let's see, what is one of my other favorite resources? We didn't get to talk about this, but I think it is really important about the visibility piece of entrepreneurship. And it's called The Formula. And the author's last name is Barabasi. And he makes the point that so often our success is not just about what are the results we're producing, but also how the network is aware of those results and how important it is to get visible with our businesses or within our workplaces. And I think this is often missed. Like we think if we have a great product, maybe people will just come they'll find us. But in fact, we really have to like create that visibility. And I thought his book was unique, and he really brings this point home. And it's really important for entrepreneurs. So that would be my last one.
All right. Thank you so much. All the resources are perfect, and I'm sure the listeners, the winners, can go check them out and read more information about what we discussed today. I want to really thank you, Dr. Carla, for your time today. I want to say thank you for your knowledge, all the knowledge you shared on the act of decision making using principle as a guide. I want to say thank you to all the listeners, and I'll be coming. Dr. Carla is actually going to be coming up on the next episode of the Winners Circle, and she'll be discussing a very great topic: how she, switched from the medical field into executive coaching. So we're going to discuss about that. So you need to watch the next episode. You need to stick to this the podcast, and make sure you subscribe so you can get a notification anytime we have a inspiring conversation. So I think that's all for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Carla, again. One last thing. Do you have any last word for the listeners as we round up?
Goodness, I always just recommend. We've said a lot, and I thank you so much for having me, and just for the privilege to be on your show and to share ideas with your audience. So I just appreciate that so much. I appreciate their time, and my last thought is just build some momentum. If there's some place you're stuck, don't worry about doing it perfectly. Just figure out how to get started, because it both will feel really good, and also it's just once we're moving, we can steer. But it's hard to steer when we're not moving yet. So that is one of my biggest pieces of advice.
No, thank you, Dr. Carla. So have a nice day, guys. See you next time.
This is the symbol of adewole silicon. This is the symbol of adewole silicon. This is the symbol of adewole silicon.